Chapter 1. In Petersburg at that time a complicated struggle was being carried on with greater heat than ever in the highest circles, between the parties of Rumyantsev, the French, Maria Fedorovna, the Tsarevich, and others, drowned as usual by the buzzing of the court drones. But the calm, luxurious life of Petersburg, concerned only about phantoms and reflections of real life, went on in its old way and made it hard, except by a great effort, to realize the danger and the difficult position of the Russian people. There were the same receptions and balls, the same French theatre, the same court interests and service interests and intrigues as usual. Only in the very highest circles were attempts made to keep in mind the difficulties of the actual position. Stories were whispered of how differently the two empresses behaved in these difficult circumstances. The Empress Maria, concerned for the welfare of the charitable and educational institutions under her patronage, had given directions that they should all be removed to Kazan, and the things belonging to these institutions had already been packed up. The Empress Elizabeth, however, when asked what instructions she would be pleased to give, with her characteristic Russian patriotism had replied that she could give no directions about state institutions, for that was the affair of the sovereign, but as far as she personally was concerned she would be the last to quit Petersburg. At Anna Pavlovna's on the 26th of August, the very day of the Battle of Borodino, there was a soirée, the chief feature of which was to be the reading of a letter from his lordship the bishop when sending the emperor an icon of the venerable Sergius. It was regarded as a model of ecclesiastical, patriotic eloquence. Prince Vasily himself, famed for his elocution, was to read it. He used to read at the Empress. The art of his reading was supposed to lie in rolling out the words, quite independently of their meaning, in a loud and sing-song voice alternating between a despairing wail and a tender murmur, so that the wail fell quite at random on one word and the murmur on another. This reading, as was always the case at Anna Pavlovna's soirees, had a political significance. That evening she expected several important personages who had to be made ashamed of their visits to the French theatre and aroused to a patriotic temper. A good many people had already arrived, but Anna Pavlovna, not yet seeing all those whom she wanted in her drawing-room, did not let the reading begin but wound up the springs of a general conversation. The news of the day in Petersburg was the illness of Countess Bezzukova. She had fallen ill unexpectedly a few days previously, had missed several gatherings of which she was usually the ornament, and was said to be receiving no one, and instead of the celebrated Petersburg doctors who usually attended her had entrusted herself to some Italian doctor who was treating her in some new and unusual way. They all knew very well that the enchanting countess' illness arose from an inconvenience resulting from marrying two husbands at the same time, and that the Italian's cure consisted in removing such inconvenience, but in Anna Pavlovna's presence no one dared to think of this or even appear to know it. They say the poor countess is very ill. The doctor says it is angina pectoris. Angina? Oh, that's a terrible illness. They say that the rivals are reconciled, thanks to the angina, and the word angina was repeated with great satisfaction. The count is pathetic, they say. He cried like a child when the doctor told him the case was dangerous. Oh, it would be a terrible loss, she is an enchanting woman. You are speaking of the poor countess, said Anna Pavlovna, coming up just then. I sent to ask for news, and hear that she is a little better. Oh, she is certainly the most charming woman in the world, she went on, with a smile at her own enthusiasm. We belong to different camps, but that does not prevent my esteeming her as she deserves. She is very unfortunate, added Anna Pavlovna. Supposing that by these words Anna Pavlovna was somewhat lifting the veil from the secret of the countess' malady, an unwary young man ventured to express surprise that well-known doctors had not been called in and that the countess was being attended by a charlatan who might employ dangerous remedies. Your information may be better than mine, Anna Pavlovna suddenly and venomously retorted on the inexperienced young man, but I know on good authority that this doctor is a very learned and able man. He is private physician to the Queen of Spain. And having thus demolished the young man, Anna Pavlovna turned to another group where Bilibin was talking about the Austrians. Having wrinkled up his face he was evidently preparing to smooth it out again and utter one of his mots. I think it is delightful, he said, referring to a diplomatic note that had been sent to Vienna with some Austrian banners captured from the French by Wittgenstein, the hero of Petropol, as he was then called in Petersburg. What? "What's that?" asked Anna Pavlovna, securing silence for the emote, which she had heard before. And Bilibin repeated the actual words of the diplomatic dispatch, which he had himself composed. "The Emperor returns these Austrian banners," said Bilibin, "friendly banners gone astray and found on a wrong path," and his brow became smooth again. "Charming, charming," observed Prince Vasily. "The path to Warsaw, perhaps," Prince Hippolyte remarked loudly and unexpectedly. Everybody looked at him, understanding what he meant. Prince Hippolyte himself glanced around with amused surprise. He knew no more than the others what his words meant. During his diplomatic career he had more than once noticed that such utterances were received as very witty, and at every opportunity he uttered in that way the first words that entered his head. "It may turn out very well," he thought, "but if not, they'll know how to arrange matters." And really, during the awkward silence that ensued, that insufficiently patriotic person entered whom Anna Pavlovna had been waiting for and wished to convert, and she, smiling and shaking a finger at Hippolyte, invited Prince Vasily to the table and bringing him 2 candles and the manuscript begged him to begin. Everyone became silent. "Most gracious sovereign and emperor," Prince Vasily sternly declaimed, looking round at his audience as if to inquire whether anyone had anything to say to the contrary. But no one said anything. "Moscow, our ancient capital, the New Jerusalem, receives her Christ," he placed a sudden emphasis on the word her, "as a mother receives her zealous sons into her arms, and through the gathering mists, foreseeing the brilliant glory of thy rule, sings in exultation, Hosanna, blessed is he that cometh." Prince Vasily pronounced these last words in a tearful voice. Bilibin attentively examined his nails, and many of those present appeared intimidated, as if asking in what they were to blame. Anna Pavlovna whispered the next words in advance, like an old woman muttering the prayer at communion. "Let the bold and insolent Goliath," she whispered. Prince Vasily continued. "Let the bold and insolent Goliath from the borders of France encompass the realms of Russia with death-bearing terrors. Humble faith, the sling of the Russian David, shall suddenly smite his head in his bloodthirsty pride. This icon of the venerable Sergius, the servant of God and zealous champion of old of our country's weal, is offered to your imperial majesty. I grieve that my waning strength prevents rejoicing in the sight of your most gracious presence. I raise fervent prayers to heaven that the Almighty may exalt the race of the just, and mercifully fulfill the desires of your majesty." What force! What a style, was uttered in approval both of reader and of author. Animated by that address, Anna Pavlovna's guests talked for a long time of the state of the fatherland and offered various conjectures as to the result of the battle to be fought in a few days. "You will see," said Anna Pavlovna, "that tomorrow, on the Emperor's birthday, we shall receive news. I have a favorable presentiment." Chapter 2. Anna Pavlovna's presentiment was in fact fulfilled. Next day during the service at the palace church in honor of the Emperor's birthday, Prince Volkonsky was called out of the church and received a dispatch from Prince Kutuzov. It was Kutuzov's report, written from Tatarinova on the day of the battle. Kutuzov wrote that the Russians had not retreated a step, that the French losses were much heavier than ours, and that he was writing in haste from the field of battle before collecting full information. It followed that there must have been a victory. And at once, without leaving the church, thanks were rendered to the Creator for his help and for the victory. Anna Pavlovna's presentiment was justified, and all that morning a joyously festive mood reigned in the city. Everyone believed the victory to have been complete, and some even spoke of Napoleon's having been captured, of his deposition, and of the choice of a new ruler for France. It is very difficult for events to be reflected in their real strength and completeness amid the conditions of court life and far from the scene of action. General events involuntarily group themselves around some particular incident. So now the courtiers' pleasure was based as much on the fact that the news had arrived on the Emperor's birthday as on the fact of the victory itself. It was like a successfully arranged surprise. Mention was made in Kutuzov's report of the Russian losses, among which figured the names of Tuchkov, Bagration, and Kutuzov. In the Petersburg world this sad side of the affair again involuntarily centered round a single incident, Kutuzov's death. Everybody knew him, the Emperor liked him, and he was young and interesting. That day everyone met with the words, What a wonderful coincidence. Just during the service. But what a loss Kutuzov is. How sorry I am. What did I tell about Kutuzov? Prince Vasily now said with a prophet's pride. I always said he was the only man capable of defeating Napoleon. But next day no news arrived from the army and the public mood grew anxious. The courtiers suffered because of the suffering the suspense occasioned the emperor. Fancy the emperor's position, said they, and instead of extolling Kutuzov as they had done the day before, they condemned him as the cause of the emperor's anxiety. That day Prince Vasily no longer boasted of his protégé Kutuzov, but remained silent when the commander-in-chief was mentioned. Moreover, toward evening, as if everything conspired to make Petersburg society anxious and uneasy, a terrible piece of news was added. Countess Helene Bezzakova had suddenly died of that terrible malady it had been so agreeable to mention. Officially, at large gatherings, everyone said that Countess Bezzakova had died of a terrible attack of angina pectoris, but in intimate circles details were mentioned of how the private physician of the Queen of Spain had prescribed small doses of a certain drug to produce a certain effect, but Helene, tortured by the fact that the old count suspected her and that her husband to whom she had written, that wretched, profligate Pierre, had not replied, had suddenly taken a very large dose of the drug, and had died in agony before assistance could be rendered her. It was said that Prince Vasily and the old count had turned upon the Italian, but the latter had produced such letters from the unfortunate deceased that they had immediately let the matter drop. Talk in general centered round three melancholy facts: the emperor's lack of news, the loss of Kutuzov, and the death of Helene. On the third day after Kutuzov's report a country gentleman arrived from Moscow, and news of the surrender of Moscow to the French spread through the whole town. This was terrible. What a position for the emperor to be in. Kutuzov was a traitor, and Prince Vasily during the visits of condolence paid to him on the occasion of his daughter's death said of Kutuzov, whom he had formerly praised, it was excusable for him in his grief to forget what he had said, that it was impossible to expect anything else from a blind and depraved old man. I only wonder that the fate of Russia could have been entrusted to such a man. As long as this news remained unofficial it was possible to doubt it, but the next day the following communication was received from Count Rostophin. Prince Kutuzov's adjutant has brought me a letter in which he demands police officers to guide the army to the Ryazan road. He writes that he is regretfully abandoning Moscow. Sire, Kutuzov's action decides the fate of the capital and of your empire. Russia will shudder to learn of the abandonment of the city in which her greatness is centered and in which lie the ashes of your ancestors. I shall follow the army. I have had everything removed, and it only remains for me to weep over the fate of my fatherland. On receiving this dispatch the emperor sent Prince Volkonsky to Kutuzov with the following rescript. Prince Michael Illarionovich. Since the 29th of August I have received no communication from you, yet on the 1st of September I received from the commander-in-chief of Moscow, by Yaroslavl, the sad news that you, with the army, have decided to abandon Moscow. You can yourself imagine the effect this news has had on me, and your silence increases my astonishment. I am sending this by Adjutant General Prince Volkonsky, to hear from you the situation of the army and the reasons that have induced you to take this melancholy decision. Chapter 3. 9 days after the abandonment of Moscow, a messenger from Kutuzov reached Petersburg with the official announcement of that event. This messenger was Michaud, a Frenchman who did not know Russian, but who was quoique étranger, russe de cœur et d'âme, asterisk as he said of himself. Asterisk though a foreigner, Russian in heart and soul. The emperor at once received this messenger in his study at the palace on Stone Island. Michaud, who had never seen Moscow before the campaign and who did not know Russian, yet felt deeply moved, as he wrote, when he appeared before Notre Très Gracieuse Souverain asterisk with the news of the burning of Moscow, don't les flammes éclairantes sa route. Asterisk, 2. Asterisk our most gracious sovereign. Asterisk, 2, whose flames illumined his route. Though the source of Michaud's chagrin must have been different from that which caused Russians to grieve, he had such a sad face when shown into the emperor's study that the latter at once asked. Have you brought me sad news, Colonel? Very sad, sire, replied Michaud, lowering his eyes with a sigh. The abandonment of Moscow. Have they surrendered my ancient capital without a battle? Asked the emperor quickly, his face suddenly flushing. Michaud respectfully delivered the message Kutuzov had entrusted to him, which was that it had been impossible to fight before Moscow, and that as the only remaining choice was between losing the army as well as Moscow, or losing Moscow alone, the field marshal had to choose the latter. The emperor listened in silence, not looking at Michaud. Has the enemy entered the city? He asked. Yes, sire, and Moscow is now in ashes. I left it all in flames, replied Michaud in a decided tone, but glancing at the emperor he was frightened by what he had done. The emperor began to breathe heavily and rapidly, his lower lip trembled, and tears instantly appeared in his fine blue eyes. But this lasted only a moment. He suddenly frowned, as if blaming himself for his weakness, and raising his head addressed Michaud in a firm voice. I see, Colonel, from all that is happening, that Providence requires great sacrifices of us. I am ready to submit myself in all things to his will, but tell me, Michaud, how did you leave the army when it saw my ancient capital abandoned without a battle? Did you not notice discouragement? Seeing that his most gracious ruler was calm once more, Michaud also grew calm, but was not immediately ready to reply to the emperor's direct and relevant question which required a direct answer. Sire, will you allow me to speak frankly as befits a loyal soldier? He asked to gain time. Colonel, I always require it, replied the emperor. Conceal nothing from me, I wish to know absolutely how things are. Sire, said Michaud with a subtle, scarcely perceptible smile on his lips, having now prepared a well-phrased reply, Sire, I left the whole army, from its chiefs to the lowest soldier, without exception in desperate and agonized terror. How is that? The emperor interrupted him, frowning sternly. Would misfortune make my Russians lose heart? Never. Michaud had only waited for this to bring out the phrase he had prepared. Sire, he said, with respectful playfulness, they are only afraid lest your majesty, in the goodness of your heart, should allow yourself to be persuaded to make peace. They are burning for the combat, declared this representative of the Russian nation, and to prove to your majesty by the sacrifice of their lives how devoted they are. Ah, said the emperor reassured, and with a kindly gleam in his eyes, he patted Michaud on the shoulder. You set me at ease, Colonel. He bent his head and was silent for some time. Well, then, go back to the army, he said, drawing himself up to his full height and addressing Michaud with a gracious and majestic gesture, and tell our brave men and all my good subjects wherever you go that when I have not a soldier left I shall put myself at the head of my beloved nobility and my good peasants and so use the last resources of my empire. It still offers me more than my enemies suppose, said the emperor growing more and more animated, but should it ever be ordained by divine providence, he continued, raising to heaven his fine eyes shining with emotion, that my dynasty should cease to reign on the throne of my ancestors, then after exhausting all the means at my command, I shall let my beard grow to here, he pointed halfway down his chest, and go and eat potatoes with the meanest of my peasants, rather than sign the disgrace of my country and of my beloved people whose sacrifices I know how to appreciate. Having uttered these words in an agitated voice the emperor suddenly turned away as if to hide from Michaud the tears that rose to his eyes, and went to the further end of his study. Having stood there a few moments, he strode back to Michaud and pressed his arm below the elbow with a vigorous movement. The emperor's mild and handsome face was flushed and his eyes gleamed with resolution and anger. Colonel Michaud, do not forget what I say to you here, perhaps we may recall it with pleasure some day. Napoleon or I, said the emperor, touching his breast. We can no longer both reign together. I have learned to know him, and he will not deceive me any more. And the emperor paused, with a frown. When he heard these words and saw the expression of firm resolution in the emperor's eyes, Michaud, quoique étranger, ruse de cœur et d'âme, at that solemn moment felt himself enraptured by all that he had heard, as he used afterwards to say, and gave expression to his own feelings and those of the Russian people whose representative he considered himself to be, in the following words. Sire, said he, your majesty is at this moment signing the glory of the nation and the salvation of Europe. With an inclination of the head the emperor dismissed him.